They called it peace. But the Sahel has long learned, peace signed in Algiers rarely comes without a shadow. Before the world could forget the flames over Tinzaouaten, Algeria stepped forward with an offer. An honest broker, they called themselves. A nation eager to mediate between Mali and the northern rebels. On the surface, it sounded noble. But when the fire of one drone still smolders at the border, the word peace tastes of smoke. This was not a new chapter. It was a recycled page, ripped from the Algiers Accords of 2015, a deal that brought arms to rebels and silence to Bamako. Today, the faces may have changed. But the game, it remains the same. And yet, something is different this time. Mali is no longer the silent party. AES is no longer a shadow. And Ibrahim Traoré is no longer watching. If you believe sovereignty is more than words on paper, like, comment, and subscribe. Because what Algeria offered may not be a handshake, but a chess move. And Bamako is ready to play. July 21, 2025, President Tebboune speaks. We are ready to mediate between Mali and the northern factions, but only if Bamako makes an official request. Algeria will not tolerate mercenaries along our 1,400 kilometers border. The world heard diplomacy. The region heard warning shots. But Mali heard silence and memory. No handshake. No request. Only the cold wind rolling over Tinzaouaten. Only the echo of a war once signed in French but paid for in blood. What Algeria offered was not peace. It was a stage. One last chance to reclaim control of a border that no longer feared them. Because behind the olive branch lies a story never told. It was once called the Accord of Hope. A document wrapped in promises and printed in French ink. The 2015 Algiers Accord was supposed to end the decades-long conflict in northern Mali. The world clapped. The Tuareg delegation smiled. Algeria posed. France whispered. Mali signed. But that paper, that fragile treaty, was never meant to hold the weight of sovereignty. Because behind the ink were weapons. And behind the smiles, factions. The Algiers Accord offered decentralization, but it empowered the separatists. It promised integration, but gave safe passage to fighters. It claimed to bring peace, but froze the war in amber. For Mali, the cost was never just territory, it was trust. Entire northern towns slipped into the hands of armed coalitions. Meanwhile, Fama, the Malian armed forces, were confined, demoralized, and blamed. And Algeria watched from the highlands, shuttling delegations, holding the microphone, but never shedding a tear when bombs went off in Gao or Kidal. In secret corridors, commanders from the Front de Liberation de El Azawad met with figures close to Algiers. Phones buzzed. Arms flowed. No one in the West questioned how rebels kept regrouping. Because the story had already been written. Mali was the failed state. The North was too complex. Algeria was the adult in the room. Until the silence broke. By 2023, the ground shifted. Fama had drones now, Bayraktar TB2S from Turkey. They had Russian armored vehicles. And more importantly, they had a reason. No more negotiations with ghosts. No more borders drawn with double standards. Kidal fell. The Tuareg factions lost their capital. And with it, the spell of the Algiers Accord was broken forever. The world gasped. But Mali stood taller. They had fought for their own soil, and won. And when the world tried to scold them for undermining a peace process, Bamako responded with a question. Whose peace? In Algiers, the silence turned to murmurs. Suddenly, Algeria remembered it had a stake in Mali. Suddenly, they cared about dialogue. Suddenly, they feared instability. But the Sahel remembers differently. The Sahel remembers who watched and who walked away. Who trained rebels and who tied the hands of a state. The mediators never bled in the red dust. Enter AES. In 2023, when Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States. It wasn't just military, it was metaphysical. A declaration that sovereignty could no longer be subcontracted. That the memory of colonial borders, foreign bases, and staged peace talks had expired. And with AES, a new vocabulary emerged. One where stability didn't mean surrender. Where dialogue didn't mean disarmament without security. Where sovereignty wasn't a footnote, it was the title. Burkina Faso sent advisors. Niger offered joint patrols. And Ibrahim Traoré sent one message. The Sahel will no longer rent its peace. It will own it. But Algeria's story wasn't finished. When Mali declared the Algiers Accord dead, they didn't just reject a document, they rejected an era. The drones started flying. The borders hardened. The French bases were evacuated. And the rebel sanctuaries across the border suddenly didn't feel so secure. In March 2025, a Malian drone flew too close to Tinzaouaten. It was shot down by Algerian forces. Algiers called it defiance. Mali called it betrayal. And the world called it silence. Now, the offer is back on the table. Mediation, again. But this time, only if Bamako agrees. This time, with conditions. This time, with warnings. But Mali has seen this table before. They know the wood is polished, the papers are crisp. But the knives underneath are still sharp. This is not about Tuareg autonomy. This is not about humanitarian corridors. This is not even about diplomacy. It's about who owns the final word in the Sahel. And this time, the final word won't be written in Algiers. If you believe the time for African-made peace is now, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice stand where so many were silenced. Because this is not just about Mali. This is about the right to define peace on your own terms. And the broken accord was only the beginning. It was supposed to be just another surveillance mission. March 22, 2025, a Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drone lifts off from a Malian base, silent in the sky, its sensors trained toward the Algerian frontier. Tinzaouaten. A name burned into maps and memory alike. Where smuggling routes intersect with the shadows of rebellion. At 13:04 local time, a blip on the radar. Algerian forces track the drone as it drifts over the contested air corridor. At 13:07, a surface-to-air missile is launched from a forward base. 3 minutes later, Mali loses contact. The headlines would come fast and loud: Algeria shoots down Malian drone. But the real explosion came inside Mali's Ministry of Defense. The military brief was curt, almost surgical: drone TB2 shot down near Tinzaouaten while monitoring movement of JNIM splinters and Tuareg militia concentrations. Airspace dispute cited. But this wasn't just a drone. This was an eye. A symbol. A signal. And for Mali, an act of war. The response? Decisive. Within 24 hours, Bamako recalled its acting ambassador from Algiers. Within 72, airspace corridors along the eastern Sahel were closed to Algerian aircraft. By the end of the week, the Mali-Burkina Border Command went to red alert. AES command posts entered silent readiness. Yet Algeria claimed innocence. Tebboun's press secretary read from a prepared statement: "The Republic of Algeria remains committed to regional peace and the sovereignty of its skies." But maps were redrawn behind the scenes. Intelligence units began to re-evaluate patterns of border activity. Every tribal crossing, every fuel truck, every suspicious signal from the sand, now subject to deeper scrutiny. Africa Corps drones began patrolling parallel arcs, not just near Tinzaouaten, but deeper into the three-frontier zone. French outlets accused Mali of escalating. Russian military blogs praised the FAMA's resolve. In the West, the headlines were clinical. In the Sahel, whispers turned into questions. Why Tinzaouaten? Why now? Old treaties resurfaced. The 2015 Algiers Accord, long dead in Mali's eyes, was now being cited by Algiers as the legal spine of its protest. But the accord had died the day Keitel fell. Everyone knew it. Only Algeria pretended it still breathed. So a line had been crossed. Not just territorial. A red line. But what did that red line really mean? For Mali, it was a sovereign test. For Algeria, it was a veil pulled back. The skies were no longer neutral. The border was no longer buffer. The Sahel was no longer asleep. Within days, intercepted chatter revealed the movement of Tuareg-linked operatives toward refugee camps inside Algerian territory. Drone footage showed convoys masked under humanitarian covers. Mali's parliament called for an emergency session. AES responded swiftly. A joint communiqué between Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako framed the incident not just as aggression but as a warning. A call to reinforce regional skies. The Africa Corps deployed a second wave of ISR drones to flank the border. Electronic warfare units jammed specific frequencies known to be used by insurgents. Aerial surveillance intensified at choke points, especially around Tinzaouatine and Bouessa. Suddenly, the skies above the red sand no longer belonged to Algeria alone. And in Algiers, silence. Strategic silence. Until July 21. President Tebboune, dressed in diplomatic calm, offered mediation. Cameras rolled. Anchors hailed his wisdom. But Mali saw something else. A reset attempt. A move to reframe the crisis under older rules. Because this wasn't about just a drone. This wasn't about technical boundaries. This was about memory, muscle, and message. Kidal had fallen. AES had risen. The balance had shifted. And Mali, bloodied but resolute, now saw clearly where the next battle line was drawn. If you've followed this story this far, ask yourself, what is the price of sovereignty? Not in speeches, but in wreckage, silence, and radar pings. If you believe that defending your land should never require permission, like, comment, and subscribe. Because this isn't about just a drone. It's about who owns the sky above the Sahel. And who decides where the line ends. The red line had been crossed. But the real war had not begun in the skies. It had begun on maps. In the war rooms of Bamako and Algiers, strategists weren't just counting drones. They were redrawing cartographies of control. The terrain became text. Each valley, each outpost, each smuggler's route turned into battlegrounds of perception. Tinzaouatine was no longer just a checkpoint. It became a symbol. A node in a network of contested legitimacy. Algeria called it a buffer zone. Mali called it sovereign territory under siege. Old colonial maps resurfaced. French-drawn boundaries were held up by diplomats like sacred scripture. But Mali tore through them with boots on the ground and satellites in the sky. Africa Corps sent up ISR balloons, scanning movement patterns by day and heat signatures by night. In Geneva and Addis Ababa, debates erupted over Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense. Mali argued that drone surveillance was a lawful measure to protect against jihadist spillover. Algeria claimed it was provocation. Meanwhile, JNIM cells laughed from the shadows, thriving in the cracks between accusations. The maps on television looked simple. But the truth was more tangled than Sahel thornbrush. Each side claimed to defend sovereignty. But whose sovereignty? The states? The people's? Or the ghosts of colonial borders? In the refugee camps near Bouessa, displaced Tuareg families told another story. Of drone buzz at night. Of checkpoints that shifted daily. Of loyalty caught between survival and suspicion. On July 5, a convoy was spotted near Tinzaouatine. Officially, it carried humanitarian aid. Unofficially, Malian intelligence flagged it as a potential arms route for EFLA insurgents. Africa Corps tracked it silently, then jammed its comms. The convoy turned around. Tensions escalated. Social media flared with footage, some real, some AI-generated, showing drone strikes, militia patrols, and crowds chanting both anti-Algerian and anti-Malian slogans. The war of maps was becoming a war of narratives. And at the center stood AES. Not as an empire. But as a refusal. A refusal to be mapped by others. A refusal to accept that old treaties signed in Paris or Algiers defined their lives. On July 14, a joint AES operation launched, Operation Memoir, a coordinated border lockdown, data collection mission, and geofencing drill. Every phone tower, every signal ping. Every heat trail across the desert sand, logged, analyzed, mapped anew. Algeria protested again at the African Union. But the AU had grown quiet. Weary of a new generation rewriting rules that weren't theirs to begin with. In Mali, President Goïta addressed the nation. Sovereignty is not drawn in Geneva. It is walked with boots, coated with satellites, and defended with unity. If they redraw the map, we redraw our reality. And so the maps kept changing. But so did the men who held them. The Sahel, once passive terrain for empires, now became a live canvas of resistance. On July 18, satellite intercepts picked up unusual traffic, encrypted pings bouncing between coordinates in Algeria's Elisi province and Tuareg sympathizers in northern Mali. The pattern suggested something more than communication. It hinted at coordination. By July 19, AES intelligence teams had geology-okayed 3 likely nodes, supply caches buried under what were declared protected cultural sites. Mali, backed by Burkina Faso's mobile radar units, established a temporary no-fly zone 30 kilometers deep into its territory. A new map was drawn. Not on paper. On screens. Live. Dynamic. Updated every hour by algorithms fed with drone footage. On-ground intel, and civilian data. The Sahel was no longer lines and legends. It was living resistance. On July 20th, a final blow to illusions of peace, an intercepted broadcast from an EFLA commander boasting that the weapons from the Tinzaouatine corridor would strike down the AES alliance before August ends. That night, the AES leadership met in an undisclosed bunker in Gao. There, under the flickering glow of real-time satellite images, they approved a new doctrine. No cartography without sovereignty. If this message resonates with you, if you believe the Sahel deserves to chart its own course, like, comment, and subscribe. Because no one else will tell the story of how a line became a front line. And how resistance became cartography. While the world focused on Mali and Algeria, another map was being drawn. Quietly. Invisibly. In conference rooms lit by PowerPoints, not gunfire. In Brussels, at NATO's southern desk, the Algerian delegation wasn't there just to discuss migration or energy. Sources confirmed that Algeria had offered intelligence cooperation in exchange for regional stabilization resources. In plain English, cash, tech, and silence. At the same time, Morocco ramped up its Atlantic diplomacy, inviting ECOWAS members to closed-door talks about a new Trans-Sahel security framework. On the surface, it was about trade. But underneath, it was about containment. Containing AES. In Abuja, a leaked memo from the Nigerian Ministry of Petroleum warned that the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline project could be redirected through Morocco. Reason: security concerns in the Tinzaouatine corridor. And in Paris, former Sahel envoys met behind closed doors. Not to intervene directly, but to map influence. NGOs, media narratives, diaspora scholars, all were part of what one strategist called terrain shaping. The map was not just a border. It was a web. Climate reports were weaponized. Drought zones turned into leverage. Projections showed that if Algeria blocked water routes from the Ahagar Mountains, downstream agriculture in northern Mali would collapse in 2 harvest cycles. Satellite data on migration patterns were shared selectively. One EU commissioner called the Sahel the new Libya. A buffer. A warning. A place to manage, not empower. But the biggest twist? A confidential report surfaced in Addis Ababa, evidence suggesting that Algeria had provided secure channels for discreet negotiation between remnants of MNLA and a foreign energy firm interested in lithium deposits near Kidal. The ink hadn't dried, but the message was clear. While Mali mapped sovereignty, others mapped minerals. Back in Gao, Captain Traoré met with Goïta. No cameras. No press. Just one sentence emerged from that meeting. They want peace on paper. We build peace in fire. Because sometimes the real map is not drawn in lines, but in silence. If this hidden war of maps and influence opened your eyes, like, comment, and subscribe. Because in a world of invisible hands, the first step to freedom is seeing the strings. The border is not just a line on a map. It is a line between the past and the possible. For decades, foreign hands drew these maps. In Berlin. In Paris. In Algiers. They told us where to stand, what to defend, and how far we could dream. But in 2025, something changed. A drone was shot. A convoy was tracked. A corridor was sealed. But what really broke was the illusion that the Sahel was too weak to define itself. Today, the lines we draw are different. Not of exclusion, but of determination. They are traced by farmers who refuse to flee. By soldiers who code satellites. By leaders who do not bow. And if they redraw the world, we redraw ourselves. So if this story stirred something in you, if the courage of Mali and the resolve of AES means something more than politics, like, comment, and subscribe. Because this is not just the end of a conflict. It is the beginning of a map we draw ourselves.